And then we're going to follow up with John Crock. He's the director at the University of Vermont Consulting Archaeology Program, another former colleague and friend. He's also an assistant professor at the University of Vermont Anthropology Department. And he's going to be talking today on the archaeological investigations at the Burlington Cantonment and the Soldiers' Burial Ground.
Thank you, Jess, and I'm happy to be here during Archaeology Month to talk about the archaeology associated with the War of 1812 here in Burlington. We've heard some of what historical documents can tell us about the past, and archaeology, of course, offers a different view, one that's not recorded oftentimes by history and sometimes is different than what is recorded, but in many ways also sheds light on what people were doing here in Burlington. And some of the archaeology that we've done in Burlington associated with the War of 1812 has benefited greatly from resources provided through regulatory or compliance archaeology, such as a renewal project along North Street in collaboration with the City of Burlington that was sponsored by the Vermont Agency of Transportation. And we've also collaborated, UVM that is, with the City of Burlington and the Community and Economic Development Office on a couple grants that they received through the Battlefield Protection Program of the National Park Service that have allowed us to explore further the archaeological resources and try to develop a management plan for their protection and preservation along with further understanding of them. Here on the slide is the Totten Map that was done in 1817 as the military was divesting itself of this cantonment, as Kate just said. And Kate Kenny, our previous speaker, I will say up front, is responsible for the large share of the research that I'll talk about in my presentation. And Kate is very humble, but her dogged research into the enlistment records of War of 1812 soldiers who died in Burlington, going through microfilm and looking for every bit of evidence, and as you saw some of the historic documents that she referred to, much of it on her own time, late at night. She's to be commended and doesn't get enough credit, but I'm giving her credit here so you can think about her as I go through. Next slide, please. What we can do with archaeology, of course, is use these historic maps to try to get a reference for ourselves and what might exist for us to study today archaeologically. One of the things you'll notice about this georeferenced Totten Map is you'll see where the bluff was, as has been referred to by Kate. What is now west of the bluff is reclaimed land down in what is Waterfront Park and the railroad. Much of that was created by removal of some of the bluff to create this infilled reclaimed land into the lake, you know, effectively where the fleet was holed up against the bluff. So certainly a lot of change has occurred since the War of 1812 in Burlington, and you can see some of the houses in here underneath McDonough's map. The battery, of course, is one area that has been preserved as a result of this early donation to the City of Burlington. But we look at this, and as archaeologists, and this particular project in general, which is we've been involved in for 15 years or so, has really taught me a lot about what to expect and what's still possible. Even in what you consider the most developed areas, there's still archaeological remains that are interpretable and highly significant, and I'll show you some of those. Going through some of the documents, this is from Kate's personal collection of postcards, but you can see some of the berms still evident in the late 1800s in this early photograph of the fountain area around what is now Battery Park. So some of these earthworks were still available to be seen, and people still understood their reference to the war. You know, much different than today when we do have Battery Park, but there's a much more distant relationship with this period of Burlington's history. Next. The slide Kate showed done in the turn of the century. Again, things still visible, modified, but the park used, but there's still some physical evidence. Next. By the late 30s, during a big public works project of the WPA, a lot of earth moving was done in Battery Park, leveling much of these earthworks, and so they're not, their location is potentially known now, but some of the features of the battery and the cantonment have been altered. So this is kind of all contributing to what we can learn and know now, and what's been taken away from us in terms of archaeological evidence. Looking back, you can see where Kate had been referring to. We have the lower buildings here in what is Battery Park, the hospital, and the buildings along what's now Battery Street. Battery Street, incidentally, as Kate showed a more recent a slide of the development of lots, was one of the last streets to be sort of punched through to the north. And so some of these structures may have preserved a little bit longer than others up to the north. Next. Looking at a map that Kate did, sort of translating this a little bit easier to see with the orientation of these buildings. So this is what we have sort of as the north side of Battery Park, the hospital building, officers' quarters, really roughly equivalent to what's now Battery Street. So archaeologically, we have a question: is there anything that can be learned about the former location of these structures? Were they somewhat preserved? Maybe they're preserved under the street itself as the street was built, and perhaps filled in over some of the foundations and archaeological remains. That question is still out there. We don't have any plans to shut down the street and do archaeology. The city will be happy to know, and I'm sure they wouldn't let us do that, but this is still a potential. Next slide. We have done some remote sensing work in there to try to see if we could, without doing archaeology, if there were any evidence of remains. This was a little bit the gradiometer or the proton magnetometer looking for residues of the structures. A little bit hard to read the results of this particular study. And with a lot of non-invasive remote sensing archaeology, you really have to further investigate it with actual excavation to get an idea of what you're actually looking at in some of these scans. Next slide. And of course, just before I talk about this archaeology, one of the goals, and particularly in a place like Battery Park, which is preserved as a park, there's no need to do archaeology. We would love to be able to preserve it in place for a time where we can learn a lot from just doing remote sensing. And I think we're getting there in archaeology, but you really have to have a serious research question to justify disturbing what is presently undisturbed and in a protected area. It's one thing, as I'll show you, in an area that's in active development. But Battery Park, we know may have some resources, but thankfully is protected and preserved, and is obviously of national significance. These archaeological resources are not your everyday features. They relate not only to the history of Burlington, history of Vermont, but obviously, as we've learned, the history of the United States and effectively the world. So they're really, really important, and their preservation is extremely important as well. We did look at this, and some of the justification for archaeology in Battery Park was to understand where these resources are. Can we understand them to better protect even what might occur in Battery Park, the emplacement of signage, redoing of utilities, buried utilities, walkways, etc. How might this inform future plans of the city? So we did do some minor excavations right along the sidewalk. A slide Kate also showed, it was definitely an attractive nuisance maybe for drivers driving by to have us down there, but fun to do archaeology in Battery Park in the fall. And some of the results, confirming what we had thought as we georeferenced that Totten Map, that there may be evidence that equated to the location of the hospital or other barracks buildings. These are hand-wrought nails, perfect for the time period, right around 1812 up to, used up until about 1830. So they're diagnostic of that particular time, likely used in the construction of these buildings, and some of the evidence of their construction or deconstruction, still present, even in areas not buried by the road. Also, we have some examples of pearlware also from that late 1700s, early 1800s period that probably relates to the occupation of these buildings in the hospital, and tells us a little bit about the foodways potentially of people, as Kate has referred to, the individual experience of soldiers. Perhaps officers were eating off of some finer pearlware, whereas soldiers may not have been. And so this may be indicative of an area there or perhaps in the hospital. Unsure, but just a small sample of what may be preserved in that area that links back to both the physical structural remains and also the daily lives and subsistence habits, if you will, and the economics of the War of 1812. Where was this material coming from? Were people bringing personal items into the cantonment? Were they military purchases? It doesn't seem like it. There seems like there's a whole range of ways that materials, domestic items got into the hands of soldiers and officers. Next slide. So here again, this is this outline of this area that we were looking at, really just west of where the hospital likely was. And again, maybe depending on the mapping. Obviously, we're dependent upon it, georeferencing onto a modern map of a historic map that was done in a short period of time. But the present guess is that much of these buildings is now under the present Battery Street. Again, Kate's map showing these in better thing. A couple others, if you look to the west of the hospital building, the magazine and the cistern, slide, which you see here on Totten's map. Other areas in the middle of Battery Park, and we thought, or Kate's research had shown that based on measurements from the Totten Map, these two may be preserved or portions of them. Just looking back at the formation of Battery Park and how it was constructed, the WPA project and so forth, still may have been additive and sort of sculpting the surface, but things beneath the surface may still be protected and preserved. So we did a little bit more non-invasive study to look at these. This is an area that we targeted based on Kate's research for the location of both the magazine and the cistern. Next slide. And in collaboration with the UVM Geology Department, Professor Laura Webb and a class of geophysics students, one of their class time fieldwork opportunities was to come down and do a ground penetrating radar study of this particular section of Battery Park. And we got some pretty interesting results to orient you. There's the Indian and the band shell down in the lake in the distance. And looking at these, again, hard to interpret, but the darker green is some resistance that the radar is picking up. Next slide. And in this area, you can see there's a slight orientation of material here, right where this magazine was predicted to exist. And so I think it's highly probable that these remains here, there may have been a stone foundation on the magazine itself, may have been better constructed than some of these other structures that existed in the cantonment. And so there may be some research questions that can be answered by doing archaeology here. It's certainly an area that should be watched and protected. This is about a half meter to a meter below surface, this particular scan slice of the ground penetrating radar. The other feature is down here. Almost exactly where Kate's map data predicted the location of the cistern. Next slide, you can sort of see it right here. At about 2 meters depth, it's coming up with this high red signature, which is equivalent to a cavity or some other higher radar signature. This is the Indian Foundation here. But also the cistern in there. Cistern locations, particularly when they were backfilled, potentially it was closed off and decommissioned at the abandonment of the cantonment. They can provide archaeologists with time capsules, if you will, of material remains, whether they were accidental inclusions in a cistern or well, or whether they were actually intentionally put in there to add to fill, to close it off, to make it less of a hazard. But the cistern was something that was added because initially in the occupation of the cantonment, soldiers had to go all the way down to the lake to get water, but then a conduit was built to feed the cistern. So it was a very important feature, and like the magazine, protected within the cantonment itself. The other aspect that we've done perhaps a little bit more work with was the soldiers' burial ground. Long known in Burlington, and again, one of these things that Burlingtonians have lived with, I think, since the war ended, that soldiers who had died as a result of battle or as a result of treatment in the hospital or as a result of disease were buried not too far north. And individuals remembered and are quoted in documents remembering from the 1820s and 1830s when they were children walking through the brambles, seeing the soldiers' burials, marked with wooden grave markers with initials carved in them. As we all know, as Northeasterners, the preservation of wood does not last very long, and so those markers quickly eroded, and the area quickly grew up with brush. And so the soldiers' burial ground, which was located on, I think, private property, is that correct, Kate, at the time, north, to the north, this area was quickly forgotten about, and the city grew up around it. We had the city fairgrounds located there until a grandstand collapsed tragically, and then the fairgrounds were moved out of town. But another reference to the intersection roughly of North and Front Street where the soldiers' burial ground, or a portion of it, was located. Slide. And then there are these historic incidents where the soldiers' burial ground comes up again into public view. You have, in the 50s, skulls unearthed. You have folklore of families building addition or homes or gardens and remains coming up, some of them that don't make the paper. Even in the late 1800s, you have UVM medical students coming down into the soldiers' burial ground and accessing samples for their studies. Using with knowledge of where the burial ground was. And so to say it was forgotten is a little bit disingenuous because people knew where it was, we just didn't know the full extent of it. And so as soon as these grave markers eroded, as soon as the area grew up, as soon as the city grew over it, we then have some of our earliest veterans of the United States effectively as MIAs. They are in unmarked graves, and we don't know exactly where they are, but based on Kate's research, there could have been as many as 500 buried in the soldiers' burial ground. You heard maybe 200, 250 died of disease alone. And so this is what grew up around Burlington. Here's the Front Street, North Street intersection, and you have history going forward, bringing us into the 2000s, the current millennia, when we actually did some archaeology associated with it. So there was a project to essentially bury all the utility lines in North Street. You'll notice North Street does not have any telephone pole utility lines any longer. It looks beautiful. Thank you to the city. This was a project that was actually reviewed for archaeology, and archaeologists thought, you know what, there's been so much development here. the houses, the streets. Initially, it was thought, there's no concern with this intersecting the burial ground or War of 1812 resources, given that this amount of development has occurred. And it took then Detective Andy Higbee, who had a report from a construction worker who had started this utility project. A couple construction workers whispering, "I didn't see anything. You didn't see anything? No, I didn't see anything." They buried a skeleton found in the excavation of a drainage manhole drain, and this report got back to the Burlington police. They investigated. Construction workers said, "Oh yeah, we buried it just to make sure it was safe. We didn't want anything to happen to the burial," and that prompted the Historic Preservation and the Department of Transportation to call for a tighter investigation of the project, particularly in this area. Next slide. And just to show you, as a result of a couple different projects, one at the corner of North Street and North Avenue, and then the one on North Street. And then Kate on this map has shown the red dots represent historically reported burials, and the open red circles, unconfirmed reports based on family records. So you can see how many, are documented historically, and the yellow, blue, green are the ones we've actually excavated archaeologically. So a number of graves identified, all in this particular area, and some of them with some planned orientation. The other thing about this study of the burial ground is, how were they buried? Was it a mass grave where all these people were placed? No, we know that for sure. Who buried people? Getting to the anthropology part of archaeology, studying the practice of burial and how it was done, this has allowed us that opportunity. Here is the emplacement of the utility lines and a couple of the grave shafts identified. Basically what we did first was strip off the upper surface, looking for grave shafts, and then, if present, exhumed those individuals that were directly going to be impacted by the trench. Next slide, you can see how close these buildings are. Here's a couple, one here, another there, being excavated right at the doorstep of some of these houses on North Street. Believe me, living on North Street at the time was pretty exciting, pretty horrifying, depending on your perspective. It was great for public archaeology. We had people dropping off their children as sort of a daycare to watch. We had passersby. We had new residents, immigrants to Burlington, who just thought that this was really sick, and why we were exposing skeletons, particularly when we worked there at night to try to get the work done before the project was to be finished, and also to protect some of these remains as we excavated them. Next slide. Some detailed drawings taken of the graves with grave inclusions or personal effects mapped out. Number of individuals, many buried, most buried in coffins, now long since eroded. But also some challenging contexts to excavate. This is underneath the foundation of a house. You can see we had to hire a mason to help us deconstruct and reconstruct the person's house, who graciously allowed us to excavate because they were happy to have the skeleton that was half in their basement removed. But this is kind of what happened. These burials are roughly 6 feet underground, and the city grew up. Many of the houses initially built there with dirt cellars. There are undoubtedly burials encountered during the construction of houses, but many, many more exist in protected environments, and some of them inside and outside of existing structures. Preservation ranged in terms of archaeological preservation. A lot of preservation of organic material, which we don't typically get for very old archaeological sites in Vermont, but this site being a couple hundred years old, we had preservation of fabric, for example, and we could tell by the position of some things. Some of the soldiers were buried in shrouds. Some may have been fully clothed, or were fully clothed in uniform, likely. Also, some effects like buttons, enabling us to look at some of these. And thanks to the Maritime Museum, and Chris is here, did some of the conservation work on some of these pieces, able to reconstruct what buttons, what regiments were represented by these buttons, and also very clearly identify these as soldiers. Interestingly, the state of Vermont, the Historic Preservation Office, wrote to the Department of Defense when this work was being undertaken, and then Secretary Wolfowitz, I believe it was, and said, we really need some assistance. We have a very significant War of 1812 cemetery here. How do you know they're military? Well, they have military buttons. They're buried right north of the military cemetery. We have records there was a cemetery there. They still were not convinced, I think we have enough evidence now to certainly convince folks of the significance of this and how it deserves preservation and protection no matter where these resources are in the city. Also some conserved fabrics, in terms of this piece, it's a leather gun sling. This piece was actually placed under the skull of one of the individuals that was buried. Gives us a little bit of sense of the ceremony that went into the burial of at least some individuals. It wasn't just, okay, let's dump them outside. There was probably some graveside ceremony in at least some cases, possibly regiment members, comrades, family members potentially. But we had, as Kate showed, a wide range of people participating in the conflict from very far away, from the south, a lot of Vermonters too. But this is just one window in the small sample that we have of how people were treated. Next slide. Another stamped leather hat cockade recovered under the same skull of this individual. Pewter eagle that once was there is eroded. But this too, along with probably a jacket placed with a gun sling under the head of this individual, just speaks to a little bit of the personal history of the conflict and what we can learn from archaeology about burial treatment during wartime. Well, again, looking at this, hard to imagine that there's anything preserved to be studied underneath all of the developments of the city. But this project and look into it really does show that these resources can still exist and coexist with a modern city. Next slide. Despite these folks bearing 200 years, long after the invention of some of these buried utilities, which became remarkably close in many cases to disturbing burials. In one case at the corner of North Ave and North Street, we had a case where a gas station was built there and a burial was encountered, and all the bones were stacked neatly next to the excavation that was done for the tank. And so I don't think any report was made, but there was care to move them to the side. And so the archaeology of that kind of also tells us a little bit of how people historically have treated these remains, in some cases unceremoniously, and in some cases with at least some deference and consideration given who these individuals are. Here's a map looking at some of the burials, and again I said we've got these in a line. This was not a haphazard cemetery. This was at least somewhat planned out. Given how rapidly it was populated, it was probably pretty easy to see the prior disturbance of a grave shaft to know where the next one was. Many may have been done in the same day, of course. And you can see some of these encroaching on an actual building structure, others that were identified right in the course of the sidewalk. And this happens to be some green space in between a couple of buildings. And just showing you, here's the green space and here's how these kind of line up from the street view back to the green space. So looking at some of these areas that are unbuilt, we can try to estimate how many are out there. Where are they? Of course, it's something that residents of the area, homeowners, would be interested in knowing. And I think archaeologists would too, particularly in the preservation of them or the investigation should they require exhumation. And so we did some more work. Haven't done GPR, ground penetrating radar, in this location yet, but we did do some gradiometry work on this parcel. And you can see right here, if you, next slide, Jess, right there, a couple likely candidates right in line with this other row here. So it's one way we can look at undeveloped lots and investigate this area for the potential for human burials. We obviously have a number that are still out there and are interested very much in preserving them and discussing what do you do? What do you do if you know they're there? Do you leave them in place? They've been there for a long time. Do you mark them? Do you exhume them and rebury them somewhere else at great cost? It's one of the open questions, I think, for resource managers. And some of the things we can learn from them, could we ever identify these individuals? A big question that Kate has spent a lot of time looking into, and this comes from her combing of the enlistment records. We know the age at death of the individuals that had who died in Burlington, who had at least this information recorded. We can then compare that with our archaeological data, with the skeletal remains. We know this individual is 15 to 18. We know he's Caucasian, male. Stature also recorded in some of the enlistment records. We can compare that with skeletal information to try to take that list of 500 individuals and narrow it down to a possible list of representatives that this individual who this person might be. Also, Kate's work has shown also the anthropology of it in the sense of where these people were coming from. Who were they? We were seeing a giant depletion of able-bodied farmers, who were enlisting and ultimately dying in this case. Other occupations you can see here listed, just about everything listed, but farmers making up the majority. We can study the human remains for evidence such as muscle attachments that are much more robust in people that have been engaged in manual labor throughout their life. Very different than perhaps a tailor or somebody who may not have been as active in their profession. And so that may help us too to narrow down this list. Next slide. The other avenue, using something that's really, really powerful in archaeology, bone isotope analysis. As we grow, we take up oxygen isotopes from our water source. And water sources have different values of this particular isotope based on where your water is coming from. And here's some broad ranges for the eastern US that show bands of signatures of isotopes that you can then compare with isotopes still resident in human remains to essentially get at nativity data, get at where this person was born from. Was this a Vermonter, or is this somebody who came from the South? This is another angle that we can use to sort of funnel down the enlistment records and to get at. And this is one other argument that we've made at the state and ultimately federal level. This is not just a Vermont archaeology issue. This is a national issue. These are people who came from all across the eastern United States to participate who are buried here. And this is just another way. Another is DNA analysis, much more expensive and much more difficult to extract. The preservation of DNA that would get you to a family level is much. It doesn't preserve as well, although we do have some burials that have samples of hair where this could be extracted. The military, the Joint Pacific Area Command, who does MIA recovery in the Pacific, has participated with us and has done some DNA sampling on some of the individuals. And we may, for some of them, we can get at individuals who had disease. We certainly can use DNA to get at the sex of the individual if it's not apparent based on the skeletal information. But we can also get at things at broad ethnic descent groups, where these people are coming from, potentially combined with surnames and all this other information. But then, ultimately you need genealogical information. You need samples from living members of these families to be able to compare with, so you can imagine the scope of that project and the difficulty in funding such a large endeavor. And so it leaves us with our work with the city and the State Historic Preservation Office to identify the most likely areas for these resources and to educate people as much as possible so that in the event of future ground disturbing activities that these receive study and the proper preservation. Also, we hope to work a lot more with some of these non-invasive methods to identify these resources. But again, thanks to the collaboration with the city and historic preservation for the opportunity to participate in this project. And again, thanks for Kate for all of her thousands of hours of volunteer work to make this possible. I get the benefit of summarizing it for you. But thanks very much and look forward to questions later today.